I would argue, I know that play is not always fun, but it is kind of fun. There are generally many definitions on play. Overall, I try to understand it as a self-guided personal interest activity that is, often self-determined, which is also why a lot of games researchers, at least in HCI, come to turn to self-determination theory when they're trying to look at how people enjoy their games. But when it comes to disabled populations, I have noticed a thing. I've looked at it specifically in the context of games and neurodivergence, together with Katrin Gerling, and what we found is, I quote, playfulness as an enjoyable, self-determined, voluntary, fun, and essentially unproductive concept is largely absent for neurodivergent players. Instead, the rhetorical concept of fun in games is exploited for the sake of othering neurodivergent populations further to, quote-unquote, cure them, to, quote-unquote, identify them through diagnosis, to imply that their sociality and knowledge is insufficient, and to use notions of inclusion while pointedly conceptualizing neurodivergent as deviant from neurotypical norms. I understand bodily difference as holistic, like in the concept of a body-mind strategy. So I don't see mental or physical disabilities as kind of like a difference. I just understand them all as different embodiments in the world out there, which is why I'm going to just talk about bodies. So because play is ultimately always very embodied, because as I said earlier, you have a body. So everything you do is ultimately embodied. So, Katrin Gerling again and I used the surrogate body theory to understand this a bit better. And so the surrogate body theory, which comes from media studies, particularly film studies, it has been developed by Christiane Voss. That theory says that immersion happens when a viewer lends their affective, and that means also emotional, responses to a film by embodying those emotions, and that leads to a metaphorical body that is made up between the intersubjective interplay between viewers and film, and then facilitated through physical and aesthetic distancing. So where is that surrogate body? What do people do? Coming back a bit to the emotions and actions, so games are a bit different from the cinema because you lend actions as well. And it can be hugely diverse across different play scenarios, which we can all understand as embodied, but it just also has different types of bodily involvement. Like in this case, you do have more kind of like constrained actions at the same time. So bringing the surrogate body theory into play doesn't just mean that we're able to extend that theory, but it also helps us understand more of how bodies play. And there are lots of bodies playing, and we understand bodies in different play contexts and what that might mean more and more, but we struggle to account a bit for that in design. There are inherently ableist assumptions that lead to the design of inaccessible technology. And how can we reimagine games or the kind of like dispositives that shape them as a technology or kind of like a technological setup that accommodates bodily diversity? And I think we need to recognize that both within research and industry, we still engage in the creation of disabling and exclusive body-based technologies. All right, but there is some kind of issues like with the ultimate technological premises as well, because most technological design and development is underpinned by ableist assumptions that lead to the design of inaccessible technology. But I think we need to start thinking about what access entails and who access is provided for. Again, most of this talk was given in English, so whoever understands the English language in its spoken mode now had an advantage and has been provided access throughout. Most people who have experiences of access do so as an ordinary experience, whereas this is not afforded for disabled people. But if we think explicitly about what kinds of access are provided in games, that might help us more to understand also which exclusions take part. So the important thing is kind of like, we don't understand how access is facilitated, but it is so paramount to having specific types of experiences with games. But how we gain access to those also shapes what kind of things we might have, and bodies play a huge role in that diversity, in how that access is shaped. So whether a game is frustrating and a positive, failure is engaged with as a positive aspect of kind of experience, draws on like being forced to fail or getting something out of it. So for example, there are games, and this is very personal, but like there are games where I just like am giving up because I notice that I have to do this one kind of series of movements in like a certain type of speed or rhythm, and I just don't get it done or whatever, and like try half an hour, and then that is not joyful for me. And then there are games where the game supports you more and more, and it's clear that you will be able to, at some point, just by the buffs you get and all that, have an easier time going through. And that is much more enjoyable as a failure. But the point is, both cases, you don't get directly towards that experience of achievement, but one feels much more accessible. And that kind of like shapes the positive experience of failing versus the negative experience of failing, where it feels like there is no way to get around that other than that one specific movement that you might not be able to do. So this is where disability justice comes in, because you kind of have to make up for that at some point, or you could decide to make up for that, but that's the next step. First step is to understand who you include and who you exclude, but also who you provide fun for. And then, you don't have to take it that serious. You can just play with that. You can play with it. Access can be fun. Think about different ways of access. People have to queer things a little bit. They have to find and subvert ways of gaining access to things that are not are often fundamentally not made for them. And there is an aspect of like fun and enjoyment in that, and you can just play with that and appreciate the diversity of human bodies and challenge an inaccessible status quo, and look at what individuals' needs are in play, and like how they are independent of and very much attuned to at the same time to individual bodies and individual embodiments. Again, we love games, otherwise we wouldn't research them, but I think games are fun, at least personally. I kind of need them in my daily life, but I also think that as societies, we kind of need them, and like we like playing around with things. And that's why we kind of need to make sure that they're a bit more accessible. And to think about access in games is less about the functional things for me, which of course are important, but they're a later step, and they're a step of implementation, and there are ways you can kind of follow that up. But at first, we need a first step before that. We need to understand that we all have a body, that all of our bodies are different, and that access is afforded to us in one way or another, and that some of this access is feels ordinary, but is anything but. So this suggests that there's a general need to move from a paradigm of improving for, or making accessible for, or patching that, to a perspective of creating with, even not just accounting for the diversity of bodies from the very start of the system development, but also placing duty for engaging in this process with the stakeholders who seek to reap the benefits of the systems they design. Because too often we, as those people who also shape these technologies, and then too often we act as though we are a bit surprised by the inaccessibility of technology. Or perhaps we should have been able to draw this conclusion at the very beginning of the design process. And partly this is because we don't understand how access fundamentally shapes the experiences that we make with technologies, or that we can make with technologies, and also how that depends on not just access as such, but also different types of access.